During the annual Passover festival, Jerusalem's population routinely swelled to over 4 times its normal size. Hundreds of thousands of pilgrims packed into these tight-walled streets, pushing the city's infrastructure to its absolute breaking point. Every inch of that crowded space was heavily policed by the Roman Empire. Judea was an occupied territory, and the atmosphere was thick with suppressed rebellion. A single spark in a crowd this dense could ignite a violent riot. That spark arrived as a sudden rumor spreading rapidly through the marketplace. Word was passing from person to person that Jesus of Nazareth, a recognized healer, was entering the city. Within minutes, the whispers escalated into layered, deafening shouts of Hosanna. People began tearing branches from trees and throwing their coats on the dirt road. What started as a religious gathering immediately took on the distinct optics of a military parade. Yet this exact moment of overwhelming public adoration is what guaranteed his death. The cheers echoing off the stone walls directly triggered a multi-faction conspiracy to execute him. This split-screen diagram illustrates a crucial historical disconnect. On the left, we see the modern concept of a savior, associated with spiritual peace and healing. But on the right, we see the first-century Judean expectation of a Messiah, a strictly political, military liberator who would violently overthrow Roman rule. As the diagram shifts, it reveals a sharp divergence. This represents the psychological reality of misaligned expectations. The citizens are taking their desperate desire for political power and projecting it directly onto a man who is offering them mercy. Their demand for a conqueror was so absolute that it blinded them to the actual person in front of them. He was riding a donkey, a traditional symbol of peace, rather than a war horse, but the citizens only saw what they needed to see. They were cheering for a weapon they had constructed in their own minds. Because the real Jesus did not match this violent profile, their current euphoria guaranteed a severe, impending disappointment. Across the city, the religious establishment, specifically the Pharisees, watched this parade with rising terror. They held a small fraction of religious authority, but only because they maintained a fragile political tightrope with the Roman governor. Judea operated as a vassal state. The local leaders were allowed to govern their own religious affairs on one strict condition: they had to maintain absolute public order. Silence and compliance were the only currencies that kept Rome from destroying them entirely. This causal loop diagram breaks down the Pharisees' mathematical calculation. A populous uprising, like a man being declared a king in the streets, inevitably forces a Roman military response. That response mathematically ends in the total annihilation of Jerusalem. To stop the loop, the leaders condense that massive threat into a single target. The cold, decisive conclusion is that one man must be sacrificed to defuse the geopolitical bomb. You can see the immediate physical stakes of this calculation right in the streets. Heavily armed Roman soldiers were already locking their shields, forcefully pushing back against the cheering mob to contain the swelling numbers. The ensuing plot to arrest and execute Jesus did not originate from cartoonish malice. It was a product of systemic self-preservation, driven by an establishment that was terrified of losing its grip on a highly volatile city. But amidst the deafening noise, Jesus paused. Looking at the stark, quiet Judean wilderness outside the city gives a sense of the solitary reality he was actually carrying. He held the heavy burden of knowing a truth the cheering crowds could not see. He looked out over the waving branches and wept. He realized that the triumphant cheers surrounding him were entirely disconnected from the actual peace he was bringing them. The disconnect was fatal. He was offering a path to spiritual salvation, while the city was exclusively demanding a path to political dominance over their enemies. When Jesus refused to raise an army or strike down the Roman guard, the crowd's expectations shattered. The intense desire for a violent conqueror remained unfulfilled, and that frustration would pipeline directly into their screams for his crucifixion just 5 days later. It exposes a recurring pattern in human psychology. People will aggressively turn against and destroy the exact thing they desperately need, simply because it fails to look like the superficial thing they want. The triumphal entry was an act of profound self-destruction. The citizens of Jerusalem sealed their own historical fate, ultimately choosing to welcome a king while rejecting a savior.